Monday, January 27th, 2020, Maneco 64, home of alternative economics and contrarian views. So today I want to talk about a very popular subject in the UK. That's the value of people's houses. So I'm going to look at the average UK house price, the average London house price, and compare it to gold. And also show you why I think 2020 could be a very important year for UK house prices, especially as it pertains to their relative value to gold. And why gold? Well, let's go through my presentation and you will see why gold is so important to determining real value and affordability of any asset, house prices included. So gold has been a stable store of value and money for over 3,000 years. Like the foot or the inch, gold is the best measure of value worldwide, even though it is not as exact as measures like the foot or the inch. Of course, the foot and the inch measure distance. The stone or the pound measure weight. The meter measures length, of course, or distance as well. Value, of course, is more subjective, but gold has been the least imperfect measure of value throughout the ages. And that's why it's been so important for the monetary system. Through millennia, people have always reverted to gold as a measure of value for commercial transactions, a store of value, and also as a form of payment for other goods. Gold, therefore, has facilitated indirect exchange and has therefore eliminated the need for barter. If it wasn't for gold, the gold standard, the monetary system of the last few hundred years, I think it would have been very hard for the Industrial Revolution to take place, for specialization to take place, for people to be able to become self-sufficient and be able to specialize in their professions and be able to indirectly exchange the products of their labor for other products. It wouldn't have happened. So up until 1971, the world had always operated under monetary systems backed by gold, silver, or even copper. That meant that the paper currency people used was ultimately backed by a certain amount of gold and or silver. But on August 15th, 1971, US President Richard Nixon suspended the convertibility of US dollars or Federal Reserve notes into gold. From 1944 until 1971, the British pound's exchange rate was fixed versus the US dollar, and the US dollar's exchange rate was fixed versus gold at $35 per 1 troy ounce of fine gold. The British pound was therefore indirectly fixed to a weight of gold. But as you see here, the UK was under a gold standard domestically from 1717, when the Master of the Royal Mint, Sir Isaac Newton, effectively put Britain on a gold standard. The UK remained under a gold standard until 1914. Under the gold standard, one could convert their banknotes into gold sovereigns. So up until 1914, you could take a pound banknote to the bank and get 1 gold sovereign. There's a 1952 gold sovereign. This mechanism was called convertibility of banknotes into specie, specie being the gold coin. What this mechanism encouraged was the stability of the currency, as bankers could not afford to issue an inordinate amount of promissory notes, as there was always the danger that people might want to convert their notes into specie. So basically that kept the bankers relatively honest. It kept the currency stable in terms of purchasing power. And I'll show you how much more stable it was during the Newtonian gold standard, so to speak, and ever since 1914 in the UK. So according to the Bank of England calculator, goods and services costing £1 in 1717, that's when the gold standard was set up by Sir Isaac Newton, cost £1.82 in 1914. So the inflation rate, or the debasement of the currency, was 0.3% per annum during the almost 200-year period in which the UK was under the domestic gold standard, of course. The UK, under Chancellor of the Exchequer, Winston Churchill, did go back on the gold standard in 1925, but abandoned it again in 1931. And I'm going to give you the reason why it was abandoned. A lot of critics of gold and the gold standard say that it doesn't work, but it didn't work for about 6 years there. But before the war, it worked for almost 200 years. The main reason for the failure to remain in the gold standard domestically was that the issuance of paper currency during World War I did not keep up with the amount of gold the country had. And Churchill decided to go back at the same pre-World War I exchange rate instead of writing off the debt or adjusting the exchange rate of £1 to gold. That would have meant maybe setting the pound at 3/4 of a gold sovereign or so. So he didn't do that. So it failed. And that's why it failed, because there wasn't enough gold to keep the system flowing like it did for 200 years almost. Mainly because the UK issued too many promissory notes during World War I. So since 1914, the UK has been off the gold standard domestically, except for the period between 1925 and 1931. And even though it was under an international gold exchange system under the Bretton Woods Agreement from 1944 to 1971, it devalued the pound versus the dollar in 1949 by 30% and in 1967 by 14%. The Bank of England calculator shows that goods and services costing £1 in 1914 cost £116.26 in 2019. So the inflation rate, or decrease in value of the currency, averaged 4.6% per annum. So in the 100 years or so since World War I, the average inflation rate has been 4.6%, while under the Newtonian gold standard, the inflation rate was 0.3%. So there's the difference. The reason for the increased inflation since 1914 compared to the period from 1717 to 1914 is that now the banking system, without the monetary anchor of gold or silver as well, is able to issue an almost limitless amount of fiat currency. So almost limitless issuance of currency or credit contrasts to the amount of real tangible goods an economy can produce. Houses cannot be issued in a limitless fashion like fiat currency or credit. So the simple economic rule of supply and demand kicks in, and that is why we have increased inflation or the loss of purchasing power of the currency versus real goods and real services as well. That is why I have decided to look at how the average UK and London house prices in fiat pounds have fared versus the price of gold since 1952. I have used data from the Nationwide Building Society for my analysis. So along with the nationwide data, I've used LBMA fixings of the price of gold in pounds. So let's start out with 1952 for the UK as a whole for average house prices. So you can see in 1952, fourth quarter, the average house price in the UK was £1,891. The price of gold in pounds was $12.50. That was per ounce, per troy ounce. So cost of the average house in Troy ounces of fine gold was 151.28. So all that means is that you needed 151.28 Troy ounces of gold to buy the average house price in the UK. And I've gone into 1962, did the same exercise. That ratio had increased to 213.84. So house prices had gone up, gold had stayed fixed. So that ratio is 213.84. You needed more gold to buy the average house price. I jumped to 1971 because that was the last year of the Bretton Woods Agreement. So back then, fourth quarter, average house price, 5,533. The price of gold was floating by then. It was 17 pounds and 9 pence. So the cost of average house in Troy ounces of fine gold had risen to 323.75. House prices were becoming more and more unaffordable in terms of gold. 1980, though, something happened. It was kind of a reset, and that's where 2000 comes in, and also maybe 2020. But first, let's look at 1980. That was the year when gold topped, not only in US dollars, almost near $900 an ounce, but also in pounds. Back then, the average house price was almost 24,000 pounds, as you can see. The price of gold had risen all the way to 247 pounds per ounce. So the cost of the average house dropped to 95.08 ounces. And that's the lowest it's ever been for the average UK house price since 1952. So that was the best time for people to exchange their gold, if they had gold, for houses. The ratio dropped to 95.08. So going forward to 1990, doing the same exercise as you can see here, gold had dropped back to 203. House prices kept going up. So we saw that ratio move up to 270.53. And then in 2000, that was a historic year for house prices and the price of gold, I would say. So this is the year when house prices were the most overvalued since 1952 and thereafter, for that matter. So house prices were at 81,628, the average UK house price. Gold was below 200 at 182, as you can see there. So that ratio was up to almost 500. You needed almost 500 ounces of gold after only needing 95 ounces back in 1980. Then we go forward to 2010, after the financial crisis. You can see that house prices kept going up, but the price of gold went up a lot more. We were at 908.73. So that ratio dropped back to 179.34. And as of the end of last year, as you can see here, house prices in fiat pounds or fiat currency kept going up to 215,925. The price of gold went up as well, over 1,100. The ratio has risen a little bit. It's still quite elevated compared to the 95 we saw in 1980, a little higher than in 2010, 186.49. So now let's look at the average London house price, because London is very different in terms of value to the whole of the UK. So I thought it was important that we look at the London average house price. So the Nationwide Building Society only has data going back to 1973 for London. So I've started with 1973. I will try to extrapolate the 52 and 62 prices for London a bit further along, and you'll see where I think they were back then. So in 1973, you can see the average house price in London was 12,848. Gold was at 48 pounds and 35 pence. That ratio was at 265.73, so you needed 265.73 ounces to buy the average London house. So 1980, the same thing happened for London house prices. They dropped quite a bit relative to gold. They kept going up, of course, in fiat currency, up to 30,538, but gold, as we saw, had gone almost to 250. So that ratio dropped to the lowest it's ever been since 1952 to 123.58. So I've gone through the same process. 1990 rose up to 383. 2000, that's the big year. Look at that, 807.87. So highly overvalued UK house prices versus gold. So let's continue. 2010, the ratio dropped after the financial crisis. Of course, house prices kept going up and in fiat currency, almost up to 290,000. Gold had risen to 908, so we were at 311.36. And we arrived now at the end of last year, we were at 395.89, almost 400 again. So still overvalued compared to 1980. So I've done an approximate calculation for the 52 average London house price. I got 181.53. For 1962, I got 281. So my conclusion from looking at the recorded historical data of UK and London house prices on average and the price of gold is that since the end of World War II, the years 1980 and 2000 have represented opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of affordability in the most stable and best store of value, or gold. And I've shown you how gold is important by going back at the history of gold and the monetary system. In 1980, one needed 95.08 ounces of gold to buy the average UK house, while in London one needed 125.38 ounces. 1980 was the best year since 1952 to buy a house in terms of affordability. And why do I say that? Well, in terms of real money, in terms of gold. 2000, on the other hand, represented the top in the average house to gold ratio, as one needed an astronomical 807.87 ounces to buy a house in London and 446.47 ounces to buy the average UK house. So the question is whether 2020 will be another key year for the UK and London house prices in terms of gold. Could it be the year when we see the ratio drop again to a level like we saw in 1980? The latest data showed that the London average house price to gold ratio stood at 395.89 at the end of 2019. So there is plenty of room for houses to become more affordable in terms of gold or real money. As for the UK in general, it's the same scenario, as the ratio stood at 186.49 at the end of 2019. So even if house prices in fiat pounds remain steady, we could see them drop versus gold if the price of gold continues to rise versus the paper pound. Or we could have a double whammy where house prices drop sharply and gold rises sharply as well. Keep an eye for the ratio level of around 95 to 125, depending where you are in the UK. I'll put a link below to the Nationwide Building Society website if you want to keep track of the UK house prices. I also put a link to the LBMA page where you can see where the price of gold is in British pounds. Hopefully you enjoyed this presentation. If you did, please give me a thumbs up. Make sure you share the video far and wide as well. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel, think about subscribing. And you can also follow me on Twitter, BitChute, Steemit, and DTube. I wish you all a great day. Take care. Bye.